every hour of every day. This government facility in Washington, D.C. turns paper into money. In order to keep up with demand, these machines are running 24/7, pumping out more than $500 million into the U.S. economy every day. But this is only a tiny fraction of how much money is really made. Most of our money exists digitally, and this number currently goes up by more than $4 billion every day. But where does all of this money come from? Before it ever reached your bank account, it changed hands countless times, passing through people, governments, and businesses, all after being simply typed into existence on a computer.
And that's probably the most disputed concept in economics right now. I'm talking about the government's role in money creation. Now, let's start drilling down a bit. This is the figure for gross debt for the government, every last bond outstanding divided by GDP. But when you take a look at it, there's about 40% of the debt of the government which is owned by the government. Yes, we've got a higher debt ratio when you look at this number, but more than 20% is held by the Fed. Another large fraction is held by other parts of the government. So when you break it down, there's about less than 80% compared to virtually 100% at the end of World War II. You know, it's only the debt that you owe to somebody else that should matter. And I showed last week that mainstream economists get private money creation wrong. Would it be a surprise to find they get government money creation wrong as well? So they're making a similar mistake. And I'm going to look at this statement by Mankiw that when a government spends more than it collects in taxes, it has a budget deficit, which it finances by borrowing from the private sector. The way the government spends is by putting an entry in your bank account, which is a liability of the private banks. The way it taxes is by putting a debit into your bank account. So in that sense, government spending increases bank balances, taxation reduces bank balances. So spending is actually, government running a deficit is actually increasing the money in your bank account, okay? So that is already, just even at that level, there's something wrong with the way the mainstream thinks about it. When the government runs a deficit, spends more than it gets back in taxation, as well as increasing deposits, it also increases reserves. But what are reserves? They're not money. Banks can't spend them. If I wanted to go and get a soy latte from my deposit account, I can do it. If the private banks wanted to go and buy a soy latte using reserves, they'd be committing a crime. There's only a very limited number of things that reserves can be used for, and there's limited forms in which they occur as well. There's basically reserves are the sum of the balances that the private banks have at the central bank in their accounts there, where they are like us, depositors at that level. And they're not actually money, they're funds, because in this sense, there's a limited range of things you can do with them. And in effect, they're held on trust for your depositors. So primarily you can buy treasury bonds with them. That's about the main focus. Banks used to be able to buy shares with them, but that was back in the 1920s. We all know what happened at the end of the 1920s when the market collapsed by 10% in one day on Black Tuesday. That made a lot of those banks instantly bankrupt. They had larger liabilities than they had assets. They were gone. That's why there were so many bank failures during the 1930s. And banks also did not receive interest on reserves in the past. That only began after quantitative easing. So if you want the normal situation, you'd look at a world in which reserves do not earn interest. So what actually happens with government spending, again, is that private bank accounts rise, bank liabilities rise, creating money, bank assets rise, matching the creation of money. So the loans created for the way that the assets rise for bank-created money, reserves the way that the bank assets rise for government-created money. But there's parallels in that sense. And so a deficit creates both money and reserves. A surplus destroys them. Now that's the opposite of what the neoclassicals are claiming. They've got no link at all to money creation in their model. They believe that it's dangerous when the government spends more than it takes back in taxation. But in fact, if the government doesn't do that, it doesn't create what you can call fiat money backed by the action of the government rather than by the action of private banks. So a deficit is not a bug, it's a feature. And I say fiat to describe it because, in effect, one way the government defines its territory is the extent of land over which people accept its liabilities, which is what government money is, as a form of commerce. So you define your borders as much by where your money is accepted as you do by where you have your border guards. Now, how does the government do it? Banks create money because they can mark up both sides of their balance sheet. They can increase their assets and liabilities simultaneously. So if a bank finds somebody who's willing to borrow from them, they can increase their assets via a new loan and their liabilities by putting that loan either in the borrower's account or whoever the borrower is buying something from if you're using a credit card to create the money that way. And when you look at it, how many entries do you need to explain it? It's actually relatively simple. You just need 4 entries. So this is double entry bookkeeping as the technology, but to actually show the full implications of any transaction, you have to see it 4 times, once as an asset and once as a liability for each of the 2 agents involved in the system. So here's putting together a private credit. So you have net bank lending. From the point of view of banks, it increases their asset of loans and increases the liability of deposits. From the point of view of the borrower, it can increase their assets of deposits and increases their liability of loans. So that's the matching thing you need for the private sector, and that's 4 entries. And by the way, if you want to use my proprietary software Ravel for economic analysis too, you get it as a free bonus inside my 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge, like over 600 people have already done. To learn more, apply at stevekeen.com. Now the fun thing is when you look at government, you need 8. It's not actually quadruple, it's octuple entry. And I might add, by the way, that some of the modern monetary theory mob, and very senior, did not understand this until I told them. You have deposits as an asset for the private banks and liability for the banks themselves. Reserves are an asset for the banks. So who are they a liability for? And that's the central bank. So you've got to include the central bank in there as well. We've now got 3 tables. So if you look at, here's what we've already written for the private banks. How does that cascade through the system going up towards the central bank? I've shown reserves increasing as a result of net government spending as an asset for the banks. It does the same thing as a liability for the central bank. Now, how do we balance the line? Who's doing the spending? That's basically the Treasury. Now, the parliamentarians or politicians decide the amounts, and then the Treasury is instructed to carry out those spending. So you've got to add the Treasury's account there, and the Treasury does have an account at the central bank because, not millions, there'd be hundreds of thousands of accounts perhaps, because to actually make a payment through the system, I'm aggregating all the welfare checks, all the government spending into one column. So it's all that divided stuff. I'm aggregating the whole lot together. But what you get therefore is that you're starting from the same unbalanced system, but you've now got to include the government's account inside here. So I put Treasury CRF as another liability of the central bank. And then I have that spending comes out of the CRF and taxation adds to the CRF. So now I've got this picture covered up properly. And then, of course, that's a liability for the central bank for whom it is an asset. Okay, so you cascade up again, it's the Treasury. So now you've got to look at the Treasury table. On the Treasury table, again, same story. We start by going to create an extra table, make that an asset of the Treasury. I haven't got any liabilities in there as yet. Question now is, how do we balance it? It turns out the only way you can balance this is by the government actually going to negative equity. It doesn't borrow the money from anywhere. It simply creates it. This is what fiat actually means. So it goes into negative equity. So to show that, I have to include the equity of the Treasury as part of the analysis. This is the Treasury's net worth. And then spending reduces the net worth, financial net worth of the government. Taxation increases it. So we've now got all 8 entries that are necessary there. What's actually happening in the private non-bank sector? Let's now take a look at them. Now I've made it possible to show the bank tables and all the tables actually as double entry on the canvas, but this will do for the moment. So you bring out the private non-banks, their asset is deposit accounts, and the spending doesn't come with any strings attached. You don't have to repay the government if it spends money on you. The tax, you've got to give it to the government. So as government spending increases the financial net worth of the private non-bank sector, and taxation reduces it. And what you've got out of that is a balancing picture. This is the whole system, just looking at government spending to begin with. And what is a negative for the government in terms of financial equity is a positive for the private sector to precisely the same magnitude. So there's government spending, puts the Treasury into negative equity, and the private non-banks into positive. Taxation does the opposite. The question now is, how can the government cope with being in financial negative equity? And the answer is because it's the government. It has massive non-financial assets. All the apparatus of the government itself, the military, the police, education system if you have one, all the various elements that go to make up the government are non-financial assets. And a non-financial asset is an asset to its owner and a liability to no one. And what we are using the monetary system for is to create those non-financial assets, largely, or speculate on them and so on as well, unfortunately. So a house is a non-financial asset, but your consumer goods are non-financial assets, and the government's non-financial assets are just enormous. The trouble is no one likes it at any level to see your financial assets are exceeded by your financial liabilities. So even politicians fall for this panic. But the reality is they're the only group, government is the only group that can actually support the system, because if you have negative financial equity as an individual and you can't pay your mortgage, then you can lose the house, okay? You can't just print money to make it up. The government can create, in fact does create, the money needed to meet its financial commitments. So it's the only entity in a society which can sustain negative financial equity indefinitely. And that is partially what is the essence of being a government. Because you're a government, you can insert control over the region in which you govern by having your liabilities accepted by everybody as a means of payment. That's fundamentally how you can define a government in a monetary sense. So it must run a deficit. So this is the UK. So it's not often that the accounting is done properly, because most people don't realise the role of government. The statisticians don't necessarily collect the data, but the Office of National Statistics does do this for the UK, and that's the list of financial net worth, all the negatives. They're talking trillions here. If you do the accounting properly, the government's in negative equity. It's been that way, it's recording the data since 1987. That's the common situation of the government, and that enables the rest of us to be in positive net equity. And the classic example of that is the 1920s under Calvin Coolidge. What I want to finish here with is showing what happens when you bring loanable funds in, because all the paranoia about government spending and all the ignorance about private sector lending comes from the model of loanable funds. It just has to go. To me, it's one of the classic pieces of Ptolemaic epicycles and deference in their classical economics. So if you put the model of loanable funds and put government spending rules into that model, you inevitably get a crisis. That's the file I'm showing here. The basic private sector operations are the top ones. Then the government comes down here, and you have rules of fiscal responsibility. There are rules of parliaments, which have required governments around the world, when they run a deficit, they're required to issue bonds equivalent to the deficit plus interest on existing bonds. So I can model that quite easily by saying if government spending exceeds taxation, you get a deficit, and the government has to issue bonds equal to the deficit plus interest on existing debt. Now, that's quite simple to bring it into a model. When you model this in loanable funds, where no money is created, no action at all on the asset side of the banking system's ledger here, when you do that, you get an exponential increase in the level of government debt. So government debt after 100 years is hitting 4,000% of GDP, interest payments at 200%. Of course, long before that, your government would collapse. And that's the sort of thing which neoclassicals have in their mind. There's no money creation in the model. So that's the catastrophe that politicians like Rachel Reeves and so on have in their brain cells, and they believe this is going to be the cause of a crisis. And the government primarily banks at the central bank. Yes, it has some accounts at the private bank, but fundamentally its major accounts are at the central banks. Simply make those changes to the structure of do nothing else. And this is what you get. You move, this is the vision of loanable funds, that the debt is owned by the households, and the government banks with the private banks, leaving the Bank of England with almost nothing to do. The government banks with the Bank of England, and then the interest payments are made to the banks rather than to households. So simply making all those changes without any other change in the system stabilises. Rather than 4,000%, you get a debt level of 22%. That's just because of the parameter values I've used. Rather than interest being 200% of GDP, it's about 1%. There is no crisis. So it's just a huge error to think about the economy that way. Now, what I haven't included in that model yet is the other transactions, because I went from the model of loanable funds to the model of what I call bank-originated money and debt. If I had things like open market operations, their impact in the loanable funds is entirely different to what it is in the real world. So what I've now done is I'm now including that in the finished table. So we know that banks sell bonds to non-bank financial institutions and wealthy individuals, so there's bond sales. And they destroy money, because the way that non-bank financial institutions are the primary buyers, this is where the shadow banking system comes in. The way they buy them is by reducing their deposit accounts at the banks in return for the bonds. So for them, it's an asset swap. And then the central bank, what the central bank is doing, it trades bonds with banks and non-bank financial institutions all the time through open market operations, and sometimes much larger using quantitative easing. And these are undertaken mainly to control the interest rate but also to guarantee that there'll be enough reserve funds for any primary auction. So you've got a sliding window operation for normal open market operations. If the central bank will sell bonds if the market rate goes down to the bottom of its target range, and by selling the bonds, bond prices fall, that increases the effective interest rate. And if the market rate's to the top of its range, then the bonds, that increases bond prices, that reduces the interest rate. So that's the mechanism the government, the Treasury operates on all the time. And you put the full bank table together, and that's now embedded up here as well, but I haven't yet defined flows down here for the open market operations. So this is a bank selling bonds to the non-bank sectors, both NBFIs and wealthy individuals. This is the central bank undertaking open market operations with banks, and this is an undertaking open market operation with non-banks, and each of them has a different effect. You have to be very clear about which one is going on. So when you have bond sales to the non-bank sector, that destroys money, reduces the assets and the liabilities of the banking sector at the same time, is a way of eliminating money that's being created by the deficit. When the central bank buys from banks, then it changes the asset banking money. It doesn't change the amount of money. So one goes up, the other goes down, both on the same side of the banking system's ledger. And when it does bond purchases from non-banks, it actually increases reserves and creates money. So those, you can see how those effects differ quite substantially. Unless you get the accounting right, you're not going to understand the system. And that just rules out all the mainstream thought completely. So they can drastically change the amount of money actually created by the government running a deficit. Far less money is actually created in the end. And I haven't yet done this analysis myself, but my good friend and fellow campaigner on debt reform, Richard Vague, has done it. And this is a table he put together showing how much money is being created between 2024 and 2000. So in 2024, total deposits were about 5 trillion. Total deposits were 21 trillion in 2024. 16 trillion of money created. 62% of that was bank loans. That's the increase in bank loans over that time, roughly $10 trillion increase in bank loans. This is the banks buying bonds off the non-banks. Secondary market sales actually increase the amount of money in existence. Then you have other Fed operations. I'm not sure about this one, equity investments by holding companies. That's one of the other classifications Richard has. The overall thing is 91% of the money created since 2000 has been credit-backed money. This is in effect showing the success of all this paranoia about government spending. So all these people who whinge about government money creation are actually whinging about something they don't understand, which is private money creation. So despite the high deficits we've had since 2000, 90% of the money supply increase since that time has been from the private sector, not the government.
Like many other truth seekers, I want to learn 50 years of real economics from me in only 7 weeks. You'll love my new 7-week Ravel Economist Challenge as well. To apply, go to stevekeen.com. If you qualify, you can attend my lectures, ask me questions personally every week, and make friends with a great group of like-minded people. So again, like many others, go to stevekeen.com to apply as well for the 7-week Ravel Economist Challenge. Good luck.